Hi, it's James. You might have noticed that the last few episodes haven't discussed the largest and most obvious news piece, the coronavirus. That's because they were recorded long before the global turmoil. Despite the economic chaos, I wanted to continue with our usual programming, to share the exciting conversations that I had in the weeks preceding COVID-19. In some edge cases, there's actually been wild prosperity, and I want to share those findings with you too, and they're coming over the coming weeks. So, although in the lead up to episode 100, it seems business as usual, and we all know it isn't, I want to let you know that our thoughts are with those who are most affected in the hospitality, events, and tourism industries, particularly those in the service sector on the front lines. So we at H Media have actually developed another program called Quarantini that just shares those stories. It's in all the usual podcast nooks and crannies. You'll be able to find it over there if you search H Media. Well, we're going to keep doing our thing here, week after week, with Hospopreneurs. We're going to deliver it to you. I just hope that you're safe, that you're well, and you're maximizing the opportunities you have available to not just survive, but to thrive. So I hope you enjoy the episode with Tim today.
Let's be brutally honest right now. That's a big question.
I'm looking for someone who doesn't want to go to base camp, but they want to go to the very top.
Whether it's here, India, New York.
Civilization was born at happy hour.
That's what wins. That's what stands out. That's what people are interested in.
That's what I want to know.
The Hospopreneurs Podcast with James Henderson.
Hello and welcome to episode 97 of the Hospopreneurs Podcast. Tim Williams is the founder of Bureaux Collective, Australia's first shared coffee roasting workspace. Over a 20-year career, Tim has developed and led renowned specialty coffee brands across 3 continents, like Square Mile Coffee Roasters in London and Intelligentsia Coffee and Tea in LA. He's focused on building quality-driven coffee sourcing, roasting, and retailing operations. Today, Tim lives in Melbourne and divides his time between running Bureaux Collective, the World AeroPress Championship, and directing a small charity in rural Rwanda.
Hello and welcome to the show, Tim.
Thanks for having me.
It's an absolute pleasure to have you on. I'm very excited to get into the interview today. As you know, the first question I like to ask is a crazy hospitality story. You can take that one, or you can go with an exceptional hospitality experience. Which would you like?
I think mine kind of straddles both, actually.
Please do. Elaborate.
Maybe you can decide which of the camps it falls into. But I was thinking about this, and I'm someone who's been very fortunate to travel a lot with work and life and to visit some great restaurants. But for me, kind of one of the most memorable kind of acts of hospitality, generosity that I've experienced goes a really long way back to, I'm sure a lot of people in coffee or in food, chefs, waiters, whatever, were really heavily inspired by Anthony Bourdain and Kitchen Confidential, and I'm no exception to that. Certainly when I was 18 or 19, multiple times. And when I was living in London, not so far to head over to New York, and it was something I tried to do fairly frequently. And on the first time I went there, I just had to go to Leal and experience it. Anthony wrote so convincingly and evocatively about this place and the people who work there. I felt like I'd already spent a lot of time there. So I thought, I'm going to be in New York, I definitely have to go and have lunch and check it out. And, anyone who's been to the restaurant knows it's a pretty standard brasserie. It's good, but it's no longer there. But it's not a life-changing experience as a restaurant. But, for me, it was really interesting, and I felt great having been there. And finished up lunch, and I was heading down the street after lunch. I was probably a good 8 or 9 blocks away from the restaurant and crossing the street, heading to wherever I was going to next, and standing next to me at the lights was Anthony Bourdain, which I was obviously a bit surprised about. I'm not the most extroverted person, but I thought, when else is this going to happen?
Absolutely.
I at least have to say hello. And I felt kind of bad about he was obviously just out running an errand or something like that, and didn't want to be an annoying guy accosting him on his day off and stuff. But I thought I'll just tap him on the arm and say hello and let him know what I've just done. And he was so welcoming, and he was so sort of blown away that a big part of why I was in New York was to go to Leal. And he stood there for a fair while and was really happy to chat. We talked about a whole bunch of stuff. He insisted on taking a photo, and when he didn't think the photo was so great, he insisted we took another one. And it just really struck me that someone who has that kind of level of clout, who probably at the time, and certainly for the later part of his career, was stopped and hassled and accosted quite a lot by people, would actually be so accommodating and generous with his time. And for me, that was like so much of a bigger experience than the restaurant itself, that someone who had a really big influence on my life and on how I approached initially even getting into the hospitality industry, but then certainly later in life, the differences that Anthony made, a lot of the things that he learned from the past and sought to change in his life, it was really heartwarming and left a big impression on me to have had that experience with him. Obviously, he's sadly missed and it's a great tragedy. So I think quite fondly of that 10, 15 minutes of getting to meet him and just chatting on 6th Avenue.
What a beautiful experience. Absolutely. Yeah. And thank you for taking it in a direction there around that generosity of a magical hospitality experience. So that exceptional hospitality experience didn't necessarily come from a venue, obviously came from a hospitality personality in the street. So that's quite magical. Thank you very much for sharing that one.
Which camp does that one fall into, do you think?
Both. Yeah, thank you for describing it as both. I think it is crazy and also exceptional. Tim, I'd love to know why you do what you do.
I do what I do in some ways because I've always done it. You know, I got started in hospitality at 18, and for some people that's quite a late start, maybe not so much anymore. I keep doing it because it's constantly evolving and we get to face a whole bunch of different new challenges all the time. And there's a lot of problem solving, which I find really interesting. Yes, I'd say really for me it boils down to the variety of different things that I get to do in any day or week. But for me, it makes what I do really interesting.
What I'm looking for is fundamentally, what is it about your work that really inspires you?
That's a good question. And I ask myself that quite a lot because I think the truth of it is like not everything about what you get up and have to do every day is inspiring. And I think it's a bit of a fallacy of our time that there should be constant soul-nourishing inspiration in every single thing. Like at some point, someone needs to put up the hand-roll paper towel dispensers and stuff like that. And
that's right.
When you're the owner of a small business, all that stuff falls to you.
I guess it's about the big picture though. What is it in the big picture that really pushes you forward? Just prior to recording this episode, we had a conversation. You talked about community. So is it about the community building? I don't want to put words in your mouth, so I'm interested to know what it is on a bigger level that really pushes you forward.
I like being involved in things that bring about change. I'm fairly impatient and can get bored pretty easily. And the idea of doing the same thing over and over again is a little soul destroying. So when I feel like I'm contributing the most when I'm helping to engineer something that makes a difference, for want of a better term, that's not been so totally co-opted by the tech industry, but through what we do with the World AeroPress Championship, with what we've been able to do with Bureau and helping people who wouldn't normally get the opportunity to roast their own coffee, getting them on board with this process. These are the things that I find interesting. That's kind of selfishly, I guess, what motivates me more so than necessarily doing things that have a direct impact on other people or build a community. I like working on those things because I find them interesting, and I guess seeing them take off and seeing them grow beyond the original nucleus of an idea is a marker of the fact that they're having impact and people are enjoying or opting into that sort of experience.
So what I'm taking out of that is variety. Obviously you love variety. You've mentioned that a couple of times. That variety, keeping things interesting, dynamic. For you personally, you must get bored with the same sort of monotony, right? A lot of people in hospitality are attracted to that concept, the fact that it's not the same thing every day. In some ways it is. To become good at anything, you have to repeat a task, but I can see that that's a factor. And then obviously pushing towards growth, building things and having that impact. I think that'll come out a little more in the questions I have ahead.
Sure.
So I'm going to crack on with the next one. How do you describe what it is that you do now to other people?
That's a really good question. It completely depends on who I'm talking to and whether I want there to be a follow-up question or not. If it's dropping kids off in the playground and talking to another parent and it's a super brief kind of thing, I usually just say that I run a coffee roasting company and leave it at that. People can generally connect the dots for themselves on what that looks like. You know, if we're going to tap into slightly more detail, I generally talk about the fact that we have a company based here in Melbourne that does a number of different things. One of them is helping cafes that want to roast their own coffee get started on that trajectory. And then we source and roast a bunch of coffee ourselves. And then we have the events and championship side of the business, which is the global part. That's the bit that takes a bit more nuance. And my role in all of that is bringing all those different elements together getting people, whether it's our employees, whether it's contractors, whether it's partners or other stakeholders, involved in individual projects that I guess build into bigger elements of the overall business.
Yes. In that, there are obviously three big factors there that you described. I want to focus on the third one around competitions.
Yes.
Tell us about your involvement, say, with the AeroPress comp.
Yeah. So I first got involved probably 6 or 7 years ago. First as a judge, sort of helping out a little bit. And at the time, the AeroPress Championship, which if people aren't familiar with it, it's essentially a coffee making competition focusing on the AeroPress coffee brewer, which is a $45, $50 coffee maker. It was relatively misunderstood when it was first launched, and the championship started to find the best way to brew with it. Got to about 30 countries involved and was sort of scaling beyond what one person could coordinate. There was no money coming into it. It was all outgoings. So I got involved to essentially make it sustainable. So for the last 6-7 years, my work's been around finding sponsors and different partners, finding ways that we can put a business model behind the championship so that we can continue to make it bigger and more involved. We're now at a point where we have around 4,500 competitors per year. We have events happening in 60 to 65 countries, and we bring everyone together for the World Championship final, usually in November. And it definitely doesn't make a lot of money, but it makes enough to mean that we can keep doing it the next year. So yeah, we're about 13. I think this will be our 13th year this year. And we continue to grow it slowly and reach more people with it.
Obviously, it works well as a marketing campaign for Bureaux too, or a marketing partner for Bureaux. Was that in your mind when you started getting involved, or was that something that just evolved over time?
We actually have not combined Bureau with the World AeroPress Championship nearly at all. I think the closest we've come to connecting the two was we hosted the Victorian Regional, which was 27 competitors. But apart from that, we've actually kept Bureau completely separate from it. And that's probably something of a missed opportunity. That's something we'll probably have a look at a bit more into the future. But yeah, my first involvement with the AeroPress Championship was much more on this is an interesting project and there's a whole bunch of problems in here that need to get addressed somehow, or this thing is going to collapse. And I really like doing that kind of triage strategy work of saying, here's the bones of something good, but it's amorphous, it's unsustainable, it's working against itself in a couple of different ways. How do we actually take this, bring other stakeholders in to make it sustainable, to make it economically viable, and to make it reach more people around the world?
What are some ways that you've done that with that particular event to obviously work through those problems, find some solutions? What are some problems that you found that you worked through that eventually came through and to build the event into what it is?
Yeah, we needed to basically get out ahead of the event instead of just reacting to it, which probably sounds a bit strange, but it was all sort of like inbound and the tail was very much wagging the dog. We need to get out ahead of it and say, this is what's going to happen in this season coming up. This is when the World Finals are going to be. This is where they're going to be, so that we could give sponsors and other stakeholders who wanted to be involved somehow a bit of foresight into what they were getting involved in. And we needed to be able to communicate the value of what we were doing so that people who were involved on a hosting level or a competing level or on a sponsorship level would feel good about actually making a financial contribution to it as well, because it's too easy to say, well, I'm a sponsor of the AeroPress Championship and I'm going to send you 32 branded mugs and I've made a sponsorship. Well, I can't turn around to Qantas and say, I need to get to London for the World Championship and may I trade you 32 mugs for the airfare. The same realities that apply to being an espresso machine manufacturer or to being a coffee roaster apply to running the sort of thing that we run in the championship. And we had to get people to start appreciating that value, realising that value and making a financial contribution. We've done that very successfully in a number of ways, to the point now that actually we have people competing to be sponsors, people competing to be hosts in particular countries. We're yet to open it up to a bidding system, but we actually just try very hard to work with the right partners, provided we see eye to eye on the value that we think's inherent in the competition and what we're asking of them from both a product donation and a cash contribution perspective. We tend to be able to work really positively, and we have an incredibly low turnover of sponsors from year to year.
That's obviously a good sign as well. So it means you're doing a good job.
I think so. We'll see. We're in the middle of negotiating sponsorships for the next 3 years right now, so I'll know in a few more weeks whether we're on the right track.
Well, good luck.
Yeah.
Good luck. And you'll know by the time this episode comes out. Tim, I'd like to know what your perspective is on the role of the barista in the industry today. How's it changed?
That's an interesting question. Well, I think everything about being an employee has changed from when I was a barista, and probably the role of the barista has changed pretty dramatically too. From everyone that I talk to, it's still the most lamentable position to have to hire for, unless I'm only talking to a very small kind of echo chamber of cafe owners. Finding, hiring and retaining people who are actually really good as baristas is extremely difficult. I think that there's probably an increased level of expectation on baristas these days. When I think back to sort of how we prepared drinks 15, 17 years ago when I was doing that full time, we didn't know the temperature of the boilers on the machine, and we didn't weigh the amount of coffee going into the portafilter or the amount of liquid espresso coming out. It was very basic, I guess, primitive almost.
Rudimentary by today's standards.
Absolutely, yeah. So much of being a barista was a bit like the line cooks at Layal, and it was how many drinks can you get through in a shift, and working neat was like not necessarily a real consideration. And thinking back to it, it was pretty rough, and I'm sure the drinks tasted pretty rough accordingly. I think over time, the level of expectations definitely increased. There's been a lot of technical support to go along with it, with much better equipment. But yeah, I think baristas are kind of like physically more involved, doing a lot more functions than they used to.
What about if I step up the supply chain to roasters? Has the role of the roaster changed, and being the business that you're in, how has that role changed over the years?
I think it's hard for me to have a lot of clarity on that, having moved countries kind of 3 or 4 times in the last 10,
Because you've seen that
years.
around the world.
Yeah, and I noticed big differences, but I don't know whether that's because I've moved to another continent.
Or learned as well.
Possibly.
Taking your knowledge to the next country.
Yeah, there's really different relationships between coffee and roasting and cafes in different countries. I think that, what I learned in the States and sort of what the baseline function and expectation of what a coffee roasting business did in the States felt quite different to what it does in the UK. And then that feels really different to what happens here in Australia. I had a friend over from Ireland who has a roasting business not that long ago, and we were talking about how his wholesale was going, and he could not believe that in any situation would the roaster give an espresso machine to the cafe. Whereas in Australia, most cafe owners are working off the basic premise that I pay X amount of dollars for my coffee and I get the machine for free. Why an espresso machine exists outside the laws of economics that govern everything else that happened in their cafe, I have no idea. But that's not something that's done in Ireland.
Did someone, maybe a supplier, do that first, and it became the base for all those transactions, or all those
I
agreements?
wonder. I'm sure someone out there knows. I'm sure there's someone who's been involved in coffee in Melbourne for a long time.
Maybe even listening to this episode. If you
Possibly.
are listening, please
You're
let me know.
responsible for this,
Yeah.
Because it is kind of ridiculous, right? The idea that your meat supplier gives you a Rational oven to roast pork shoulder in if you buy enough pork shoulder. I don't know, does that happen? I'm not familiar with it happening.
Not to my knowledge, I'm not sure. Again, if someone has some more info on this, please let us know. I'd love to talk about it online. Tim, I want to come back to the role of the roaster, how it's changed. You were talking about differences between different countries as well. How has that role changed with more information readily available for people as well?
I think one of the biggest changes has been the ease of getting to origin and going to visit kind of where your coffee is coming from. And that's definitely for better and for worse. Early on for me in coffee, it was such a foreign concept, really, that, you would be traveling overseas to visit the people that grew the coffee. And it was certainly only something that happened for big roasters. And that's become more and more mainstream. And it's almost an expectation of roasters now that you'll be doing some of that travel. And like I said, there's advantages to that, and there's huge consequences that come with that too. It's very easy to co-opt good sourcing work that some people are doing purely from a marketing perspective, traveling with cameras just to grab photos, to say that you've been there, and to do what you can to drive down the price. And from all reports, I haven't done that much travel in the last 4 years, but from all reports, that's something that continues to happen and unfortunately is a predominantly an Australian roaster trait, which is a great shame. Certainly I learned so much more about coffee in general, and I understood coffee so much better in a few weeks of having been to Kenya for the first time, and to be able to see the process and understand it and meet the people and get a sense of what the challenges for people whose livelihoods are based upon an incredibly fragile plant producing cherries that are then highly susceptible to any kind of like fermentation and deterioration to then export to an incredibly wealthy market and not have a lot of insight into how that product is being traded.
How are people working towards fixing that sort of issue, this information asymmetry?
It's hugely problematic. It's hugely problematic, and there are some pretty clear lines being drawn in the sand, especially here in Melbourne. It doesn't seem to be as big in some other countries. But there's one camp that feel emphatically that you should be completely transparent with the price that you pay for your green coffee as a roaster. Mark Dundon from Seven Seeds has been a really strong advocate for this. He's a part of a group that's asking roasters to sign up to a transparency pledge to make it very clear how much money is getting paid to the farmers. And there's a very big part of me that feels like that is the right thing to do and the right way to go about it. There's another camp that feels that that level of transparency can work against the farmers, and the farmers might not be comfortable with that information being shared. There's also another faction where we see people co-opting again the outward impressions and trappings of a transparency project, and it doesn't take very long to scratch the surface before you realise they're giving you information about one coffee that they bought for the year, and the other 99 lots that they bought they keep very well hidden and very shrouded.
They might have bought a lower quality product as well.
Completely.
So it could be, another lot might be much higher quality, much higher price, and then someone could complain. They're like, hey, hold on.
Yeah.
You sold those guys that for that price.
Yeah.
Why are we getting charged this?
Absolutely. I don't think anyone has 100% the correct answer on it. I know it's something that I think about all the time and grapple with quite a lot. And I think if you're involved in coffee, you should be thinking about it. I don't think there's enough healthy discourse about it. There's a lot of finger pointing and a lot of side room chats between people.
Yeah, a very destructive or negative conversation. What are the sorts of, do you have any solutions around maybe how we can have a more constructive conversation about these sorts of things?
We've hosted a number of events to talk about some of this sort of stuff. And what we find in coffee is that maybe it's an Australian thing as well, is that people don't really want to be the odd one out. They don't really want to be the one saying, actually, that isn't good enough. Actually, this is the situation. I can understand that and I can appreciate that. But people seem to be in a bit of a middle ground of saying, we have to be doing better, we should be doing better, falling short of articulating exactly what that looks like or what they think that looks like. So, I don't have a huge desire personally to be the person that jumps in to solve it. I think it's a hugely complex issue and involves a lot of economics and that sort of thing that is way beyond my pay grade. But I think that we run a small charity in Rwanda. It's not going to be the next Oxfam. It's not going to go to a huge scale project, but we do a really solid job of helping to stabilise financial security for a small community that I've worked with for probably 7 or 8 years now. And while I've had people say to me that it's the wrong thing to do and I shouldn't be doing it at all, that farmers shouldn't be charity cases, I think to be white and privileged and working in coffee and sitting on your hands and doing nothing is inexcusable. And I sleep better at night knowing that a portion of my time and energy and effort goes into helping ensure that families that grow the coffee that we enjoy so much have a better chance of a brighter future than if we just went in there, took some photos, bought the coffee as low as we could and sold it here for as much as we could. I think that's a trait of post-colonialism that still runs really deep in Australian coffee. And if you're able to turn off that part of your brain that empathises with the growers and can trade like that, then I don't quite understand you, but that's your thing and this is mine.
There are a few different directions I could take that, or I could move on to the next question. I think I'm going to ask you one more to probe on that. In your opinion, who do you think is best positioned to have the most clout with that change?
There's supposed to be a specialty coffee association in Australia. And in fact, there's an organisation called the ASCA, or the Specialty Coffee Association. They're the Australian chapter of a much bigger organisation that does some really incredible work. And here, I don't know, I think they run some competitions, and beyond that, I don't think they do anything. It would stand to reason that that organisation should be the one doing this. The future of coffee looks pretty bleak if we don't sort out some of the pricing disparities, because there aren't that many years you can sell coffee cherries at a loss before it makes a lot more sense for you to rip out those plants and plant coca instead, because, you know, the drug cartels will give you good money for that. And at the end of the day, you know, you can be as noble as you want, but if your kids are going hungry, you're going to participate in the activities that feed your children. You would think that our Specialty Coffee Association would be doing something about that, would be educating, would be running that sort of thing. But my understanding is they don't do too much. I think they continued to petition the government to keep GST off roasted coffee, which is a nice thing. I think that takes 15 to 20 minutes a year to write the letter. You know, like I said, someone should be doing something. Someone should be pulling it together. Who's going to do it? I don't know. You're going to be pretty unpopular for a while if your whole movement is to improve things. I think, you know, Mark Dundon is doing a bunch of this, as he's pointed out pretty clearly, both publicly and in private conversations. He doesn't give a fuck what people think of him anymore. And I think he's doing good work. I don't necessarily agree with everything or necessarily exactly the way it's presented, but he's always been someone that I've looked up to since working for him many years ago. Yeah, I think he'll continue to do what he can.
With that, I'm going to move on to the next question.
Sure.
I can see you're quite passionate about that one in particular.
Yeah.
Tim, I'd like to know what you're learning about or exploring at the moment.
That's very good timing. Automation, actually. This really relates much more to the championship side of things, but my whole morning today has been working on automation of processes for how we actually get from someone who wants to host an AeroPress Championship around the world to them having all the information they need and the resources to do so successfully. And that's been incredibly labour intensive. Like I said before, we have events in 65 countries, but we also have regional events too. So we do 140, 150 events per year over 6 months. So that's an event every day. The amount of labour that goes into responding to emails, adjusting things in a CRM, sending invoices, reconciling invoices is crippling. And so I'm in the process now of basically mapping out systems that can do this much more effectively so that we can focus on the bits that really require human touch and let machines handle the other bits. It makes me think a lot more about automation in terms of roasting and brewing espresso and that kind of thing too. I know Matt Perger's like adamant that we're going to get rid of baristas in the next 5 years or so.
Listeners might remember Matt Perger came up on a previous episode of the program as well. So thank you for the mention.
Yeah, and I
appreciate that.
I don't think Matt's wrong. Like there's actually an organisation here in Australia that's doing some really interesting stuff with robotics and espresso preparation. But like coffee is like very slow to change and very slow to adapt to new technologies. I think what they're doing is fascinating, especially the way it challenges a lot of what we actually assume about coffee and people's relationship with coffee. And I think if you work in specialty coffee, you forget that for most of the planet, coffee is a functional beverage. It's something that wakes you up, and you don't necessarily want a full-blown sensory experience with tasting notes and cards and a short presentation from someone in a natty apron for every single transaction. And then if you have robotics introduced, robots don't get tired towards the end of the shift and start cutting steps in the process. You're able to use things like geolocations on phones to know how close you are to the pickup point for your morning cup of coffee, and it can be sitting there and waiting for you. And I think that to me then really just comes back to that idea about what are the bits where the humans are actually adding value, and why don't we focus on that? Because with the amount of gadgetry that's involved behind a bar now, the grinders regulate their own temperature and they grind a very specific amount of coffee, and then you carry that to the next machine, which then tamps it for you, and then you carry it to the next machine, which delivers water at a set temperature for a set duration. The barista, a lot of baristas will hate me saying this, but like the barista at the moment is sort of like the person just like moving the portafilter from machine to machine. Like we can conquer that with robotics very easily. So I'm interested to see what this company is doing and what they come up with.
Fantastic. That's what you're learning about at the moment. Thank you for
That's
sharing.
I was learning about the kind of automation stuff and bots and stuff this morning, and it just makes me think about all the other possibilities.
Yeah, beautiful. Tim, what innovations or innovative techniques have you seen across the industry in the time that you've been in it?
One of the biggest ones from the coffee roasting side of things, and it's sort of super front of mind right now, is the introduction of a piece of software called Cropster. And back when I was working in LA, I think Cropster was just an idea. And one of the founders, when I think there were only 2 people in the company, came through LA and we met and we talked about it. But it's software that manages raw coffee inventory, and then it manages how you roast that coffee. So in what's actually not that long, probably 10 years, that piece of software has really become the backbone of most quality-focused roasteries. There are other suites and other bits of software that you can use, but I think Cropster has given us an insight into how coffee is being roasted that we simply didn't have before. And coffee used to be very heavily traded upon romanticism and the sort of pathos of Italian imagery, and it was all about the smell and the touch and this kind of thing. And Cropster was really about boiling that down to data and to looking at graphs on screens. And as unexciting as that sounds, I think it's had a bigger influence on the quality of roasted coffee than most people would want to admit to. We made a small change to our Cropster setup 48 hours ago that had a knock-on effect that we didn't anticipate, which meant that Cropster has been hard for us to use. We can't imagine. It was like, the place is burning down.
What was the knock-on effect?
The knock-on effect was that all of a sudden the roasting machine, as set up in the software, wasn't linked to the green inventory. So without being able to connect those up, if we did 2 days of production roasting, we would then have to physically go through the warehouse and kind of count all the coffee again. The other knock-on effect was that without getting it all connected up again, we would be roasting blind. Or we feel like roasting blind. We'd be roasting kind of in the old school way, where we'd be putting coffee in and looking at it and smelling it and taking it out of the roaster when we thought it was done.
Back to the romanticism.
Yeah, well, and back to the Stone Ages. I just couldn't imagine us doing that. The coffee would be so vastly different. That batch of coffee would be so vastly different to what we'd roasted 2 days previously. It would have been completely unacceptable. And it's just strange to think that we're so reliant on that piece of equipment or that piece of software. But it was kind of into stark relief over the last 48 hours. There was no point where I was saying to the team, well, we'll just roast it the best you can and, it'll be fine. We need to get this software up and running again. There's just no way we can
So it's a double-edged sword.
Completely.
Obviously, it's powerful software, but you're reliant on it as well.
Absolutely. Yep.
So there's a danger in this powerful technology.
I'd say, the more insight you get into it, the more precise your expectations of yourself become. And maybe 7 or 8 years ago, we would have been fine. It would have been a case of, we know what kind of roast degree we're looking for, and we know that we want to roast it in about 11 minutes, and that would be okay. But that would only be okay because we weren't aware of how much we could know about what was happening inside that drum throughout those 11 minutes. And also we know now what a big difference that makes to the result in the cup, that we would then have to roast all the batches, wait 2 days, taste them, confirm sensorially that we were happy with that coffee being released. Whereas we have enough data now and enough historical data backed up with us tasting against those profiles to say, if the coffee doesn't perform in this particular way in the drum, we know it won't be acceptable. So we don't even have to taste it, we ditch it, we roast again. Yeah, the more you know, the tougher it becomes in some ways.
If someone wants to do what you do, Tim, what advice do you have for them?
Fail out of university first.
The classic entrepreneur story.
Yeah.
Set up a couch in a garage.
Yeah. I think it's important to go and work for a bunch of different people early on. I didn't start my own company until I was 32 or 33, which is quite late by a lot of metrics.
In the tech era, for sure.
Yeah. Although funnily enough, because you get the ideas of Jobs and Jack Dorsey and these people that started so early, but there's actually a lot of historical data that suggests that starting a company in your 40s gives you much better success rate.
Got all this knowledge from your career.
Yeah. So I, spent a long time making mistakes with other people's money, which was really good. I think that's a good thing to do. I didn't think 10 years ago this is where I wanted to be or what I wanted to be doing. So this was not like a marker in the road that I've been working towards for 10 years or so. I've literally been looking at opportunities as they come up and seeing which are the most interesting and which fit into my wife would probably disagree with this, but which fit into a broader perspective of like life in general. Her feeling would be that life in general is the 1.5% that exists outside of work. So yeah, I think as much as anything, it's about being open to opportunities that come along. And I acknowledge that that's like said from a real position of privilege. I wrote an article a little while ago for a magazine about my role and what I do, and there are definitely elements of where we ended up that have involved risk and putting a bunch of money on the line. But the truth of it is that being white, middle-class, Australian, there's very little actual risk involved. The risk involved is you lose money, you look like a bit of a dick, people think that you're a failure, but there's no risk that my kids are going to go hungry. We live in such a privileged community that if a business venture failed, there's just no chance that anyone even misses a meal. That's not true around the world. So, you know, on one hand, being open to opportunity is sort of one of the ways to look at it, but I'm very aware that the ability to seize those opportunities comes with this safety net that being who I am and where I grew up affords.
So looking at those opportunities, how do you evaluate whether something is an opportunity you should take?
Very differently these days. It used to be basically anything that was half interesting was a yes, and work out the details of it later, which meant that I've been involved in some really interesting things, but at, I would say, the cost of a lot of relationships and the expense of any semblance of a social life. These days, I am a lot more measured in what I can kind of give time to. And that's something that I've had to be really disciplined about. You know, with 3 kids, my wife with a career of her own and still only the same amount of hours in the day.
Tell me if you can increase them, by the way, if you find a way to increase those hours.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. And I think you have this like feeling that you need to pour more hours in and more hours in, but there's never enough hours. So for the last couple of years for me, it's been really about just having to say no to stuff that isn't really crucial.
How do you determine that? How do you determine if it's something that is crucial, is critical, or has some synergistic benefits to what you're doing?
I think goal setting, as much as it's like the obvious answer, but knowing actually what you're working towards. I guess if we don't have that marker in the sand, it's really hard to determine whether anything you do moves you towards that or away from it. And so there's things that I want to achieve and things that I want to do. And basically every decision has to go through the filter of whether this is a step towards that or a step in a different direction.
Yes.
Because there's not enough scope to do other things. And it's painful because it means we get presented with a lot of opportunities. Some of them would be really fun. Some of them take me to places that I really want to go to. But at the end of the day, there's a knock-on effect for everything you do. And whether that's, I've missed my wife's birthday for the last 3 years because I've been at events or been somewhere for work, and that can't continue. So I think knowing what it is that you want to work towards and filtering everything through that.
Yes.
Yeah.
Ultimately, where do you want Bureau to be?
That's a good question too. I think, you know what, I don't have an end point in mind for Bureau. We're not working towards like a particular point in the road, but I always want to be able to walk into this space or see Bureau products or know that Bureau is involved in particular activities that I'm really proud of. And that's sort of, for me, a much more important success metric than hitting a particular revenue target or a particular profitability target or whatever it might be. It's more important for me that I feel proud of what we're doing and that we've got a really good team on board and doing it.
What does that look like? Because I'm assuming that with an objective like that, you could have satisfied that right now. Do you have, I guess, some milestones that you want to hit, or is there somewhere that you want Bureau to be? Is there any hard objective that you're working towards, or is it just a philosophy? Which I'm not against myself. My personal mission is a philosophy. So I'm interested in your answer.
Yeah, I would say it's the latter. There'll be points along the road and there's little things that we want to get to. You know, we've been doing a whole bunch of roasting for a number of co-working spaces and started at a very small scale, and they've continued to grow as we've continued to grow. And I've always felt like we probably give it 90% of the attention that it should have. You know, the packaging was done pretty quickly. There's elements of the way the coffee's brewed that we want to work on and improve, but it's just finding the time to get in there and do it. And well, I'm really trying to prioritize that at the moment, because I'd say that's one of the things where I'm 90% satisfied with how we're approaching it. I want to get that to a point where I'm completely satisfied with it. And I don't think there's that much to do. That's sort of like the next short-term kind of thing. The thing is, like, there's no increased revenue or profitability as a result of that. That's not necessarily going to earn us more business, but I just know we can do better. And, you know, I think that's really important for me, and that's really important, I think, for the team that we have. They want to be working on things where they feel like the goal is to do as well as we can. It's not to do just enough and move on. We've had those people in the team at various points past, and it never goes well because that mindset is just so out of step with mine. So I think that'll be a real kind of personal satisfaction, nourishing sort of point to get to. I often think a lot about B Corp certification and some of those processes as well, which I think would be really interesting things to undertake, just because I think when you have to step back and analyse at a really kind of small scale level all the different things that you do in your business and how you do them, I think it can give you some really great insight into how you can improve. So like, it's definitely not like a clear marker in the sand of this is something we're going to do, but it always sits there in the back of my mind of something that, you know, with a little extra headspace, that would be something like achieving B Corp certification, I think could be a really interesting endeavour for us.
Fantastic. We've had a few previous guests who've been B Corp certified as well. Tim, I just have one last question for you today.
Sure.
I'd like to know who you'd like to hear on the show.
Oh, that's a good question. I don't know if he does podcasts, but it'd be really great to get Mark Dundon to come on. He's the owner of Seven Seeds. He's one of the most well-respected figures in Melbourne coffee. I'm fortunate enough that he's the sort of person I can have lunch with a couple of times a year and pick his brain, but it would be great to have him interviewed professionally to help, I think, unpack a lot of these issues around pricing transparency and the way the Melbourne coffee industry works. You know, I still feel like a total newcomer to the Melbourne coffee industry, having been away for 10 years. Mark's been here, immersed. He's helped create it and guide it to where it is now. It'd be great to hear him on talking through some of that.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for
Pleasure.
being on the program
I'll
today.
give you Mark's number at the end.
Thank you.
This program is hosted by James Henderson, with technical production by Jake Olver. Voiceovers were by Angus Brennan and Shim Phelan. Thanks to our distribution team, led by Stephanie Holland, and a special thanks to you for tuning in every week. This program was produced by H Media. We'll see you soon.